As you look at the history of God's people in the Old Testament, one thing that is clear is that the Lord is sovereign over the lives and the direction of His people. Even when Nebuchadnezzar invaded Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, burned the city walls, and carried the people away into exile in the most powerful empire on earth, the Lord is still completely in control. And even today, when things seem to be against us as His people, the church, we can be confident that we are always firmly in His hands and that He is patiently and faithfully and sovereignly guiding us together towards a glorious future with Him. Nowhere is that sovereign guidance more clear than in the book of Esther. Now, a lot of people say Esther shouldn't be in the Bible because it never mentions God specifically. But who else would the Jews think is orchestrating all these events? Why else would they fast when faced with a difficult situation unless God was there? Why would Mordecai assume that if Esther refuses to help, the Jews will be delivered in some other way? Who else would Mordecai give credit to for putting Esther into her position for such a time as this? The name of God isn't mentioned, but the writer most likely assumed that he didn't need to, because the fingerprints of God are all over this story. About 60 years earlier, through the decree of King Cyrus, the Jews had been released from captivity in Babylon. The first wave of exiles had returned to Jerusalem. They had rebuilt the temple. But at the time of Esther, there were still a lot of Jews in Babylon. And an old enemy arises with the plan to wipe out the Jews. But long before he even begins to form his plan, the Lord was already orchestrating details and events to frustrate that plan and deliver His people. He first uses the pride of the king. The king gets drunk at a banquet, and he wants to show off his wife to everyone because she's so beautiful. But his wife refuses to be put on display, and so he gets rid of her and looks for a new queen. He sends throughout the empire and brings in beautiful young women to audition to be the new queen. And that included Esther, a beautiful young Jewish woman who was being raised by her uncle Mordecai. The Lord gives Esther favor, and now, though nobody else knows it, there's a Jewish queen in Persia. Later in chapter 2, the Lord puts another piece of His plan in place. He makes it possible for Mordecai to save the life of the king when Mordecai overhears a plot to assassinate the king, and he reports it. Chapter 3, the Lord uses the pride of another leader, Haman, who is the king's top official. Haman was an Agagite, a descendant of the Amalekites who had a long history as big enemies of Israel. One day when Haman rode through the city and all the people were bowing to him, Mordecai refused to bow, most likely because he was an Amalekite. And Haman was furious, most likely because Mordecai was a Jew. Because he doesn't ask the king to have permission to execute Mordecai, he convinces the king to make a decree that all the Jews in the empire should be wiped out. Mordecai finds out, and he tells Esther about the decree, and he pleads with her to go to the king. But Esther's afraid to, because she knows that if you go to the king and he hasn't summoned you, you could lose your life. But Mordecai trusts the sovereign and faithful care of God, and he says to Esther, if you remain silent, deliverance is going to come for the Jews in some other way, but you and your family will perish. In other words, God will be faithful to His people. But if you don't trust Him, you're not going to be a beneficiary of that faithfulness. And then Mordecai adds the question, don't you think, Esther, that this is the reason that you were put into this position in the first place? In other words, you're not in this position because God decided to bless you for your own comfort, your own pleasure, and your own status. You're not in this position by your own efforts or just by good luck. You are here because God puts you here to deliver His people. Esther calls for the Jews to fast and pray for 3 days, and then she goes to see the king. Esther's plan is to tell the king about what Haman is doing. Haman's plan is to have Mordecai executed. But both of their plans are just part of the Lord's bigger plan, and He is using it all to execute His plan to keep His promises to Israel, that they would be His people and that He would continue to be faithful to be their God.